coming up.
Minister, as you know, 133 chiefs in Ontario have come together to come out against the carbon tax. In fact, they're taking your government to court because they do not feel that they were heard. Some of these chiefs are in your riding. Do you feel that it's time to axe the tax?
Well, I think I've responded to this question before.
Dalian is a two-person company. They don't do actual work. They just get government contracts and subcontract to others. How many Indigenous people benefited from the $7.9 million that your government sent to Dalian for a Arrive scam?
And their ongoing needs and their
with
and their
respect,
infrastructure.
Minister, the Auditor General has said that the department has no plan to reach the 2030 goal that you've set.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you very much. Minister, as you know, 133 chiefs in Ontario have come together to come out against the carbon tax. In fact, they're taking your government to court because they do not feel that they were heard. Some of these chiefs are in your riding. Do you feel that it's time to axe the tax?
Well, I think I've responded to this question before, certainly in the media, and in fact, that's a misrepresentation of what the letter says. In fact, what the letter says is that the chiefs would like a larger percentage of the carbon, they would like a larger rebate from the carbon tax. And in fact, should that not be possible, obviously they did. They wanted they wanted a positive answer from the government. And I'm really pleased to say that the finance minister just a couple of days ago has signed off on doubling the rebate for Indigenous communities from 1% to 2%. So that is going to be good news for the Chiefs of Ontario. And I'm really looking forward to being able to work with the Chiefs of Ontario on their priorities, which is making, of course, life affordable for First Nations people and keeping a healthy environment for the next generations, in fact, the next 7 generations to come.
Right. So the carbon tax on the cost of fuel, on the cost of food, on the cost of transport, on the cost of the actual retailer selling it, that all has implications across the chain. I seem to miss how they are actually getting a better quality of life if throughout that food chain the costs are going up each and every way. And as the parliamentary budget officer has showed, the rebates are not helping non-Indigenous Canadians. Indigenous peoples are now dealing with the fact that the rebate is next to nothing. I still don't understand how life is becoming more affordable.
I will tell you that the conversations I have with First Nations people really focus on 2 things. One, to end the ongoing colonialism that Indigenous people have faced at the hands of many governments, but in particular under the previous government, which not only didn't invest in First Nations communities, but refused to meet with First Nations leaders to talk about these very issues. The second most common thing I talk about with First Nations people is actually the climate. And in Alberta, the chiefs...
Did you take a meeting with the Ontario Chiefs when they asked for a meeting regarding the carbon tax?
I have met with the Ontario Chiefs multiple times, and in fact, Glenn Hare and I are colleagues and acquaintances, and I would say that I will meet with any First Nations chief that wishes to do so and do so on a regular basis. But let me finish my thought, Mr. Chair. In Alberta, when I met with Albertan chiefs just recently, a few months back, their biggest concern was what was going to happen with the drying up aquifers and the lack of water that, in fact, the entire province is dealing with right now. And it's a deep concern because, in fact, this means that not only is it going to prevent access to drinking water, but all of the other ways that water is used by First Nations communities for economic development is hampered by the ongoing onslaught of climate change. And that is the second most frequent thing I talk about.
So you mentioned water advisories. So Niskanta, in my friend Eric Melillo's riding, has been on a boil advisory for 29 years. Can you please update us on the status of that situation?
Absolutely.
In 30 seconds or less.
Absolutely. And I hope Mr. Melillo has visited Niskantaga. I have, and I have a deep relationship with Chief Munias. As a matter of fact, he was in Ottawa just a few weeks ago and is quite happy with the progress that we're making. There are a number of conditions that he thinks needs to be in place, and we agree, our engineers agree, before he is comfortable with proceeding with a lift. But he feels very confident that for the very first time, he is working with a government that is listening to Niskandiga's needs. And I invite you to visit Niskandiga and meet Chief Munias. They are an incredible community
Well,
doing
I
incredible
can
things.
tell you, Mr. Millilode is doing a great job for that riding, bringing
I
their
hope that
concerns
he's
to Ottawa.
visited Niskandiga. I certainly would love to bring
Well,
you
Minister,
anytime.
this is my
Mr.
time, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about housing now because you brought it up in the Auditor General's report. The Auditor General is showing that there doesn't seem to be any improvement in housing since 2015. In fact, only one of the ISC regional offices collected information about the mold strategy, which was created in 2008. Can you explain why?
Well, I can certainly tell you that for the very first time in the history of this country, we're seeing a stopping of the loss of housing. And that's important because, in fact, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, year after year, we were seeing a decline in the availability of housing for First Nations. Do we have more to do? We absolutely, without a doubt, have more to do. We have a massive investments ahead of us, and it will take all of us, in fact, not voting against things like investments in affordable housing on First Nation that I have seen and noted that your members vote against time and time again. That, quite frankly, is shameful.
Actually,
what
we're
we need
voting
all parties to
against
do.
confidence in this
What we
government.
all
That's
need,
what we're
what
voting
we need
against.
all
Thank you,
parties to
Minister.
do is to pull together and insist that we spend more money to close that gap. And I look forward to doing that work with
Well,
you.
more money is being
we're
spent
out of
than
time
ever,
on
and
this
the
round,
conditions
so
not getting any better.
Chair, Minister Haidu, Canadians would expect that the Indigenous procurement system be designed to benefit Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities, not a small number of well-connected NDP Liberal government insiders. Dalian is a two-person company. They don't do actual work. They just get government contracts and subcontract to others. How many Indigenous people benefited from the $7.9 million that your government sent to Dalian for a Arrive scam?
I think I'll just blow by all the stupid slogans and answer the question. Well, I'll tell you that the Indigenous Business Directory is
I'd love for you to answer the question. How many Indigenous people benefited from the $7.9 million that your government gave to Dalian for a Arrive scam?
So I think I'll just blow by the stupid slogans and begin by answering the question in a sincere way, which is what I would hope we would all do around this table, because these are serious issues and sincere concerns. Let me just back up and say Indigenous Services Canada does manage...
Please don't back up. Please just answer the question.
I would love to do that. Are you ready to listen?
Go for it.
All right, great.
How many Indigenous people benefited? Just the number would be fine, actually.
So the Indigenous Business Directory is a directory that Indigenous Services Canada maintains to provide to other departments of Canada a list of businesses that have been verified as either...
Sorry, Minister, this is a two-person company. They don't do any actual work. They're listed on the Indigenous Businesses Directory. They receive contracts and subcontract. That's all they do. They get government contracts. They subcontract the work to others.
Okay.
How many Indigenous people benefited from the $7.9 million that your government gave to Dalian? I'm not looking for a history of the program.
Point of
I'm
order,
just looking
Mr.
for a
Chair.
number.
Well, I think that...
Sorry, just 1 second. I'll stop the clock. Mr. Batiste, what's your point of order?
The member has asked, it's repetition. She's trying to answer the question.
Repetition.
The minister keeps getting
Jamie,
interrupted
respectfully
as-
learn the
as she does
rules,
it.
okay? It's not a point of order, and it's not a repetition issue.
Well, in
I'm
this
repeating
committee,
the
we give the
question
minister time to
because I
do
want
this.
the
I know
answer.
You're coming in from another committee, but
She's a minister, you're not.
To the
Let her
minister,
answer.
Mr.
We are
Okay.
into debate. We are into debate, but I will say that, as I noted, we ask the minister questions. We allow the minister to
Yeah.
answer.
Just the
And,
number. That's all I need.
So I'll turn the floor to the minister and to continue with your response, please.
So to understand the Indigenous Business Directory, you have to understand what it's for. And the Indigenous Business Directory is to provide assurances to other departments, including Procurement Canada, that the people on that list are Indigenous. And so that is the sole purpose of the list. It's about indigeneity.
Okay. Minister, what Mr. Yeo told the Public Accounts Committee yesterday is that the purpose of the program is not to benefit Indigenous communities, but only to benefit the particular individuals who receive the contracts. What you've just said effectively confirms that. It sounds like you have no information about whether Indigenous peoples or communities actually benefited beyond the two people who got $7.9 million for no work. Of all Dalian's contracts, totaling at least $91 million under your government, Did all of those $91 million worth of contracts benefit from the Indigenous procurement set aside? And what percentage of the subcontractors were Indigenous?
I would like, I'm actually kind of annoyed by this question because it implies that if an Italian person owned a company, then only Italian people should benefit from that company's business. And in that is an implicit, I would say, stereotype. Indigenous business owners are just like non-Indigenous business owners. And some Indigenous business owners have many Indigenous employees. In fact, many businesses do.
Minister, I'm going to spare you the false indignation here. Okay?
They're looking to turn a profit. Your question is implicitly,
no, Mr. Chair. I'm going to jump in accordance with the rules.
Discriminatory.
Yeah, of course. Here we go, Minister. Your government faces intense heat over this corruption scandal, and your response, your only response, is not to answer the question, but to accuse other people of racism. This is so typical of your government. Now, I'm going to finish, Minister. Here are the facts, right? Dalian is a two-person company. They don't have employees. There's just two of them, right? So does it seem to you a problem that this company can get close to $100 million worth of contracts from your government? They don't do any work. They subcontract. That there's no tracking of whether Indigenous people actually benefit. There's no tracking about whether other Indigenous businesses receive subcontracts. And that simply by being the middleman, they're able to claim this massive set-aside when there is no tracking of actual benefits to Indigenous communities across the country. Don't you think that's a problem?
What I would say is that whatever has happened, contractors should be held accountable, regardless of whether they're Indigenous or not. The rules don't
But do you think this is an abuse of the Indigenous procurement program? Do you think this is an abuse of the intention of the program?
Yeah, I would ask. There's only 10 seconds left.
I would say if people are on the list who are not Indigenous, it is an abuse, and that is why Dalian.
So you're fine with what happened with Dalian?
Okay, we're out of time on this.
I'd like to pick up on the Auditor General report that was mentioned earlier around housing. Of course, it notes that that your government has supposedly committed to closing the gap on housing in First Nations by 2030, but the Auditor General has found that the department has no plan to do that, and that the number of homes that is needed to be replaced due to deteriorating conditions has actually increased since your government came into office. The report has also found that many of the nations most in need are not getting proper funding, and in fact getting less funding. So how would you explain that disparity?
Thank you, and thank you for asking this question, because I think the more that we talk about Indigenous access to housing and First Nations, the better off this country will be. It's like water. We need Canadians to understand that this is of utmost priority to all of us. As I've answered this question before, first of all, the department does work very closely with communities to make sure that we understand their current needs and their ongoing needs and their infrastructure.
Minister, the Auditor General has said that the department has no plan to reach the 2030 goal that you've set.
I'm saying that the department works regularly and consistently with First Nations on the planning that they're undertaking to close those gaps, and we continue to have. Do you accept
the Auditor General's report?
We accept all recommendations. I will be clear. The Auditor General has made good recommendations, including really focusing the work to make sure that the most vulnerable communities get the care that they need, which is part two of your question. But I will also say that what I have certainly learned over the last 2.5 years, and I know that the department knows very well, is that we must do this with Indigenous partners. We cannot do it to communities. We must ensure that Indigenous communities have the authority and autonomy.
On that, Minister, the Auditor General's report has also stated that your department is not working closely with First Nations to address this housing gap. So again, we're hearing one thing here, but the Auditor General's report, which you have said
I don't
that
think
you
she
accept.
said that we weren't working closely with First Nations. I think what she said was that some First Nations who are particularly vulnerable are having a hard time accessing the housing that they need. And that is certainly something that keeps me up at night. I know the department is working very closely with those communities to determine how we can better accelerate building housing and other infrastructure in those very vulnerable communities.
Okay, thank you very much. And just with the limited time, I'd like to ask you about another Auditor General report around policing, Minister. So in 2022, The government had said that they were going to work around the clock to get some legislation on the table to support Indigenous policing services. Of course, it's 2 years later. There are 3 policing services in Northern Ontario that will soon be without an agreement moving forward. Unfortunately, this is putting the lives of First Nations people at risk, as you know, in our region, Minister. It's not just the policing itself, but sometimes ambulance services or other emergency services aren't able to do their jobs because of the lack of policing. So why is it that your government is dragging its feet on this very important issue?
Thank you very much. I will say that we do a complementary line of business, if you will, with Indigenous communities called Pathways to Safe Indigenous Communities, and it is a self-determined ability for First Nations to increase programs, interventions, and services for community safety and well-being. But you will have to ask my colleague, Minister LeBlanc, questions about the work that he's doing on developing Indigenous policing legislation, and that is work that I know is very important and dear to this government's heart.
Again, Minister, you say it's very important, but 2 years ago it was promised that it would be right around the corner and that the government would be working around the clock to get it done. That doesn't seem to add up to what we're hearing from you here today, with respect.
Well, I will say this. Oftentimes the government has a timeline that is ambitious, but we also work in a respectful way in full consultation with partners, and I look forward to the results of Minister LeBlanc's consultations with Indigenous partners, because that will help us ensure that the legislation that is resulting
thank you, Minister.
Truly meets the needs of First Nations.
I'd like to get
people.
one more question pertaining to the Federal Economic Development Agency in Northern Ontario, which of course you're the minister responsible for. Now, the service standards for providing response to applications have not been met for the Northern Ontario Development Program and the Regional Economic Growth Through Innovation Program, according to the most recent information. You've said that addressing this issue is an important issue for you. Can you explain why the department is failing to meet those service standards?
So, colleagues, I just want to say the voting period has
That's
now
incorrect.
started. We're 15 seconds into it. Minister, if you'd like to offer a brief response, then we'll suspend and vote. And then
I would
come back in.
I would just say that that is incorrect information, and that the service standards have been met within a large portion of the target. I think I'm not sure if President Gideon is here. The department works really closely, though, with programs or applicants, if you will, that haven't fully fleshed out their application yet. And so in those cases, those applications can take longer because they are not complete. And so the department works with those applicants to ensure that they have a successful return. But with applications that are complete and submitted for decision, those decisions are by and large returned in time.